I must say it's a privilege and a wonder to be here attending these days, listening to these presentations, extraordinary ideas. My role within Foundation for Water is the director, and speaking accurately, I'm managing the continuation of the work of George Adams, who is a mathematician, and of John Wilkes, who was a researcher into form and flow. And we have a varied team of scientists and induction scientists and subtle energy experts ranged around the world. So the other, apart from being invited by Jerry, thank you to come and give this presentation. I'm also here in the search for reliable and valid quantitative methods of measuring energy, especially changeable energy in water, particularly water that flows in nature. And learned a lot. Also learned that there's a huge amount yet to be learnt about this amongst the entire body of researchers. So this is what I will look at. I'm going to avoid reading out what I hope you can all see and read. And so these are these 7 steps that I'm going to go through in the next 25 minutes or so. There's been work going on in this way since the 1960s, and I am just going to have to skip across huge areas of concentrated work that individuals have done for decades. So this is a research centre in Sussex, and we have about an acre of land where we're doing field trials and 3-storey building where we also do educational work. So these are some of the folk, our predecessors. There is Steiner, who is very interested in subtle energies and developed a form of medicine and a form of agriculture which is now widespread throughout the world. Particularly as biodynamics is taking off now like wildfire in India, and it's joined in with the Gandhi movement and is expected to be being practiced in more or less every of the 600,000 Indian villages within another 10 to 15 years at the rate of the present expansion. George Adams developed a mathematics of formative processes in nature based on I can't think of the exact word, but based on the geometry of energetic influences from the periphery. And his work was continued by Nick Thomas, who died earlier this year, and we have found a successor for Nick in Florence Segerson. Taylor Schwenk you probably know of, the author of Sensitive Chaos, and John Wilkes is known well for his flowform invention. Up here, you can see, John will press the top. This one is for the light, yeah. Up here you see these are the areas that we've been focusing on, rhythms and flow, and especially these formative process and dynamic water flow, what happens in nature, energy in water, we were led inevitably to that, and then flow surface design, which I will explain soon. So inductive natural science, that's been our primary method. We have been using deductive experimental methods as well, particularly with plant growth, which I'll mention in a little while. But it was fascinating and heartening to me to hear some of the talks mentioning earlier researchers. And these two in particular are being taken a lot more notice of. Fritjof Capra has written a very interesting book on Da Vinci's scientific method. Many people are writing about Goethe's method, which is taking inductive science to a far more precise level through specific trainings, and that's my particular training. Da Vinci, I just need to say, was particularly interested in rhythms through his observations, and there's a fascinating book called The Rhythms of the World, a biography of Da Vinci's work. So if we just start looking a little bit at the main topic, and then we see what evolves out of it. So Todor Kármán is better known as Theodor von Kármán. He was a Hungarian, and that's an experimental. Oh, last. I've been. Sorry, I just need to go back and press the. Yeah. Right. So this one here is experimental Trousdell or Vortex Avenue, which is passing, and it's air, and it's passing over a fixed object there. This is a cloud formation taken from space, and these are experimental flow processes where you can start seeing natural forms beginning to appear. This is just a single movement on a horizontal plane of a brush pulled through a viscous, shallow body of water with powder on the top. One movement. This was particularly the work of Theodor Schwenk, but Wilkes in our group is continuing doing quite a lot of this. Okay. So, okay, this is another experimental piece of work where coloured water is rising vertically into a still body of water. And you can see how these three types of flow appear, where you have this laminar, harmonic, and turbulent flow. And as you can read, those are entirely the result of the relationship between momentum and resistance. Obviously, the stronger the momentum, the straighter the flow. But at a balance, you get this harmonic effect. It's a rhythmical process. And there are many, many instances in nature where you can start to see these forms appearing. As John Wilkes used to say, there are very few laws in this aspect of nature, but unending variations. This, by the way, is a river delta from about 40,000 feet. Yeah. So this is another example of water moving upwards into a still body of water. So normally, as Schwenk pointed out, normally in a river, water has many, many impulses and stimuli, and so it doesn't create a self-organized shapes like these. So again, you can see these organic shapes here. So this is a process, starts here, goes here, carries onto here, and then this is almost exactly the shape of the larynx. Schwenk did this work where he was able to experimentally form what was very similar to more or less all living forms on the planet and organs. Again, similar process, but just a little puff. And as this puff of coloured water rises up through the cylinder of still water, as it touches the very top, you get this shape. That's the meniscus here at the top. And this is a photo from above of this. And they're like snowflakes, they're always slightly different. And it's obviously a very short step to start considering these creatures that are what I've read, 97% water, and yet they're alive, they reproduce, they're conscious, and they're somehow life and consciousness is taking part in these water forms, so they're self-organizing. If we look closer into human embryology, and this is a vast study, unfortunately I have someone near where I live who can help me in this. We just take a few examples of rhythmical formative processes, apparently based on the nature of water. This here is to do with that process in this very early stage, actually the first weeks, where there are waves of tissue formation happening downwards here, and they form the very, very soft beginnings of the spinal cord and the nervous system. And also these rhythms continue unaided by any pumping mechanism that's apparent, such as hearts in the cerebro-cranial sacrum system from the head down to the metabolic region of the spine, and that continues right throughout one's life. Here is very interesting. Then this is at about 4 weeks, the little embryo here. Earlier, the heart was in the head region, and these two arterial and venous systems were quite separate, one in the egg sac and the other associated around the umbilical cord. And they have independent rhythms, and apparently the cells play at being one or the other before they decide which one they're going to run with. And then as those third week goes through, they flow in together into some sort of template, which presumably is there. Every person's blood system is different in its positioning, slightly. And then it finally forms this system here. But the rhythm and the flow processes preceded the heart taking management of it. This is the embryological process of those first weeks, and it starts here. You can see this is perhaps a better one. Here, here, and here. This is this point that we were just looking at before, there where the heart and the blood system. And so it's reminiscent clearly of this, which is a rhythmical process. This is a photograph of water coming from the sea. It will wave into one of the dams in Holland. And as this comes in, this is pulsing through a contraction-expansion process. And this is Da Vinci's drawings associated with a similar phenomenon. So again, vortex. There's a lot of interest in the vortex, of course, and from galactic to cellular. And the thing that, if you do this experiment and get that actually operating in a cylinder and drop some ink in, it's rhythmical. It pulses for a minute or two, get it going, and then drop the ink in and stand back, and it just takes on this extraordinary pulse with the water coming up this way on the outside and then returning back through, and a whole breathing process. The other pictures speak for themselves, clearly. So this is a little look in at a tiny bit of George Adams' work that was continued by Nick Thomas, and which we are working with to form flow surfaces, because there's technology coming out of this. And so here, this was the work done in the 1960s to create surfaces at the Institute for Flow Sciences in Herrischede, Germany, over which water could be flowed with an attempt to see if there's an energetic change. They had no quantitative methods. So they developed water drop from Schwenk, and they used Steigbild and crystallization methods developed by Pfeiffer and Lily Kalisko. This here is a form, a rocking form based on heart forms, and this here is an insert for an Archimedean screw, so that it rhythmically moves the water as it flows downhill upwards, and that was just one little project that John had. He was very interested to see if he could introduce rhythm and dynamic flow into the pumping system. Okay, right. Okay, flow surfaces. This was an early study from the 1960s. Okay, thank you. Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so flow surface science is an established science. It's why planes fly, and I was thrilled to find that photograph. And obviously, the other ones also speak for themselves. So there's a lot known about how to shape flow surfaces so that they interact with natural air movement and water movement more effectively. We have here developed this is a flow surface where the water comes in and goes through a figure 8, which I'll show you soon, develops a pulse, and it's based on the mathematics of George Adams. Here are a couple of examples. This here is in Gibiasco in Italian Switzerland, treating the water for the whole town. This is in Surendonk in Holland for an effluent treatment plant, 10,000 people. 810 of these surfaces at a 1 in 20 gradient. This one here is treating a 5 million litre dairy effluent pond in New Zealand, whereby the smell is taken out and the colour changes. The liquid can be sprayed onto the farm, cows back on in 3 days instead of 3 weeks, because quite simply it's not hypoxic or anaerobic anymore. It's the dynamic flow has added the oxygen and apparently extra things as well, which we want to know more about. I'm getting a bit nervous. Worked. Okay. So, can you get that going? So this is the Flowform principle, which John came across from all these form and fluid studies. And in this we can bring approximately 10 times the amount of flow into human and built environment, human use water cycle. So if you have 3 or 4 meters, 3 meters of flow form, you have a 30-meter mountain cascade with a pulse. Okay. This is in a German village, 2 meters across, so they can be created, so to speak, artistically. And then next one, this is treating a community effluent pond. And with this case, you can see the figure 8 flow and the rhythms. And we have done 5,000 projects in 50 countries in our group, and we have a certain amount of research associated with this, but a lot of very positive references. Okay, so here's another project in New Zealand. We want to know what's going on in dynamic flow in nature. It's a big question, and not enough's known about it, so I'm very interested in any discussions that we can have on this matter. So that's just a small portion of a 2-hectare lake that was transformed through the application of this here as an artistic landscape piece. So what's the size of this problem? About 15 trillion litres, which is You can't understand the size of that, or at least I can't, but another way of looking at it is 5 times the yearly flow of the 5,000 mile long Nile River is taken out of nature every year by human beings for the human use water cycle. And this is continuing. With another 15 years, we will be taking water out of 95% of the world's water sources. This is UNESCO figures. And when we do that, we don't bring dynamic flow with it. And so it becomes stagnant. And we use mechanical methods to try and deal with the many serious problems that arise from stagnant water. It's a $200 billion industry each year, which basically doesn't solve the problem and pollutes the water. So we're very interested in knowing more what happens in dynamic flow. So this leads us to energy and water, because it's not just oxygen, which is what most farmers are only interested in. We're led to this hypothesis that dynamic flow in external nature and rhythms within living nature are methods that nature uses to maintain and increase the energies within living systems that depend on water. So these are some of our qualitative methods that I mentioned earlier. I can't go into them. You may know perhaps a little bit about them. These are all to do with flowform. Flowform's not so much important, it's the rhythmic dynamic flow that we're very interested in. Flowform is a means of investigating that. So this is this FIFO crystallization, this is a Steigbelt, there's a sign of more activity here, there's disorder here, and more order in this instance. And here, these are water drops, which basically are testing so to speak, a levity factor or an ability of water to be fluid and responsive. Some of our plant work, which is managed by Dr. Jochen Schruchau, who's from Columbia University, and who's worked with NASA and the space station on studies to do with gravitational influences on plant growth. So here we're working with the plant growth, particularly the roots, wheat and cress, and there are variations around time. So time is clearly a very important factor, and I was very pleased to note someone earlier mentioned this. This here, we had 80 coriander plants and controlled as best as we could. They were all growing side by side in little planter boxes, and some were irrigated with flowform treated water, dynamic rhythmical water, and some were not. And what happened was that this is an average, so it's just to skip across, we've got it in more detail. This is how coriander would grow in the environment that it was in. But this here is how the flowform influenced coriander grew. And there's, at the moment, only one way we can understand that. That's as if it's growing in very bright sunlight. If you had this growing in Greece during a very hot summer, coriander would look like this, like that. That's the fourth leaf. This is the fourth leaf in these ones. That's the fourth leaf in these ones. This is a typical example of a response to light. It's a very strong light, and yet they were growing in glasshouse in England side by side. When we did this with lettuce, opposite thing happened. The lettuce became fleshier and more watery and larger. The same thing happens. Carrots, the roots become bigger. The plants also become sweeter and appear to resist pests. We haven't done this, but it's an observation. We haven't tested that thoroughly. So part of the questions are these plants encouraged to self-organize better because of the nature of this water? So our present project, we have some funding, and we're working with new colleagues associated with Jerry's laboratory, which we're very glad, and a Cloma laboratory as well, Benny Johansson, and some of our other independent colleagues, to basically gather, as I said, methods of quantitative measurement of changeable energy in bulk water, or water that can flow actively. In short, some method of becoming more capable and looking to manage water quality beyond chemical and organic, but into energetic water. Professor Campion says, you know, that if you're only going to look at chemical and organic qualities of water, it's like going to a doctor's and saying, well, can you check how I'm getting on? And the doctor goes, oh, lovely jacket and nice handbag, what's in it? Okay, here's your prescription. But the water itself, the person itself, is not really looked at. And that's what should be happening. All this water taken out of nature that's being used everywhere, we're all drinking it, needs to be understood better. So that's second to last slide, or third to last, but that's basically, as we understand it, the definitions are diverse, and each definition of what energy and water is requires a different method of assessing it. So first, what are the definitions? What is this energy and water? And where does it happen? Because they're clearly, from my more or less layman's understanding of the last few days, it's clearly different types of energies. They're all measured differently. We don't really know a lot about it, but we're getting there, and I've heard a few calls for us all to collate this and to create a unified approach, which that's actually the basis of our study. And I thought I'd have a shot at cartoon while I was at it. I haven't drawn it myself, but I've got it off the internet. So this seems to be not only where the Foundation for Water is, but this whole wonderful movement to understand water itself is at. And I hope we continue, take the blindfolds off, and we start talking more with each other. Summary, I don't really have time to go through that. You anyway know what I've said, so I don't need to say it again. But the aim is the long-term aim is to change policymakers, at least in the EU, to test all municipal water for energy quality. And we should be able to do that. And I particularly want to thank the Software AG Stiftung, Peter Schnell, in Darmstadt, Germany, for their support of this work. Thank you very much.